So lastly, let's think about how film and the radio developed during this period. So prior to the 20th century, moving pictures were at first sort of a popular novelty, actually much more targeted towards adults. So you had sort of naughty peep shows, penny arcades in the 1890s, particularly in Paris. But what you're starting to see once you get closer to the turn of the 20th century is that they start to become appealing towards mass audiences. So this is a huge difference from some of the art we were just looking at in previous videos because everyone wanted to consume film. One of the best examples of, a movie star, a Hollywood movie star emerging from this period would be Charlie Chaplin, represented here to the right. He was actually English, but he becomes the king of the Hollywood silver screen in the 1920s. You could see movies as sort of escapist in a sense. When people were kind of wanting to consume film as a way to kind of leave the very anxious, uncertain world that they were faced with after the First World War. We'll see this even more during the Great Depression itself. You're going to see this is not only an American phenomenon, but you're going to see also German film, oftentimes portraying expressionist dramas. One example would be something called The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari from 1919. Even more importantly, you're going to start to see the development of talking film starting in 1927. And so what this is going to do is it's going to lead to a revival of national film industries in the 1930s. So, once people could actually, listen to the dialogue and not just read along with the captions, films became incredibly popular. And by the period after World War II, motion pictures were the main, well, actually leading up to World War II even, motion pictures were the main entertainment of the masses. Again, very much a way that they could sort of distract themselves from sort of the uncertain nature of the present day. Now, one of the things that is a little bit more controversial about film is that, like radio, which we'll talk about in a moment, films could be used to indoctrinate populations. They could essentially be used as forms of propaganda. So countries with dictatorial regimes oftentimes used film to try to sort of brainwash their population. So a couple of examples of that. In the Soviet Union, you're going to see that Vladimir Lenin is going to encourage the development of Soviet films that are sort of romanticizing the development of the Soviet Union. So essentially kind of canceling out any remaining thoughts against communism, against the Bolshevik reign. So one of the most famous examples of this was directed by Sergei Eisenstein. And well, actually any film, this is just one example, one poster of a film called Strike. But Sergei Eisenstein directed many famous films, and they all sort of dramatized and romanticized the communist view of Russian history. So, it was much more common for these films to be seen because they were actually kind of sponsored by the government, encouraged by people like Lenin. So it essentially brainwashed the people because that was the only real thing that they could see. You also see this happening in Nazi Germany. There was a director, a woman named Leni Riefenstahl, who was commissioned by Hitler to direct this film called The Triumph of the Will, which is based on a Nazi party rally in Nuremberg in 1934. So here's a still image of it. You kind of see the ridiculous size of this Nazi rally. And what this film was trying to do, and again, this was all commissioned by Hitler and also his Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, a man named Joseph Goebbels. Basically, the idea was to create Hitler into sort of this godlike figure, again, sort of canceling out any kind of opposition that might exist. So these types of films were very successful in basically trying to brainwash any sort of opposition that remained in these totalitarian regimes. Radio as well, we're going to see make significant developments in the interwar period. You're going to see that in 1901, so this is actually slightly before the war, a man named Guglielmo Marconi develops transatlantic wireless communication, which is significant because it's really an instantaneous way to communicate literally across the ocean at this point. So radio was primarily used in World War I for military purposes. But then after the war was over, radio was now being used by for sort of depicting cultural ideas, actually developing entertainment programs. And so in 1920, you started to see major public broadcasts of special events, sporting events, news, things that were non-military related. The advent of these kind of public broadcasts were mainly in Great Britain and the U.S. at first. But you're going to see that different countries control the radio in different ways. So most European countries, actually almost all with the exception of the US, established direct control over the radio. So basically, the government owned the radio. Good example of this would be the British Broadcasting Company in Great Britain, or the BBC, which we still have now. But the US actually had private ownership of the radio. It's still regulated by the government, but again, this does sort of affect the types of programming that results from it. You're also going to see in countries that have dictatorial governments, just like film, radio could be used very effectively for political propaganda. So like Hitler and Mussolini oftentimes broadcasted specific programs to try to convince the public about how great their regimes were. So hopefully that is a good overview, these several videos of the Age of Anxiety. Again, we get the sense that this kind of uncertainty is reflected in so many different forms of art, literature, even science itself, music, that we see in films and radio, the government trying to literally influence the way that people think. So this will be a good sort of segue into the next section of this chapter, which is explaining how governments are developing in the post-war period, paying particular attention to the way that Germany is trying to recover after the First World War.